Welcome to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel. I'm pleased to announce at the beginning of this video that this channel has passed 2,000 subscribers recently, just in the past couple of weeks. And I know that's not a huge number. There are channels out there with 20,000 subscribers, millions of subscribers, whatever. This is a small channel, but considering the rather niche-y nature of the content that I'm publishing here, I'm really pleased with having passed 2,000 subscribers. So thank you to all of you, and those of you who haven't subscribed yet, please be sure to do so. Today I'm going to be talking about the term reliability and several different meanings of the term reliability. It's a kind of an important concept. It's important in all kinds of contexts of ordinary life. It's also important in the area that's of most interest on this channel, which is the Gospels and apologetics for Christianity, and what kind of arguments we can make and should make, and whether they're strong or weak, in evaluating different arguments for Christianity. There are meanings of the term reliability that I think we should be cautious about. One that I want to just state up front is not a place where I think we should use the word reliability. That is when a person will say, I'm defending the reliability of the Gospels, but then all that he will defend is the idea that we can get certain facts out of the Gospels, maybe even have a list or something. This was interesting back in 2012 in a series of debates that Craig Evans did with Bart Ehrman on whether the Gospels are reliable, and supposedly Dr. Evans was defending the yes side of that, but Dr. Ehrman correctly pointed out that he really wasn't, that he was advocating instead using criteria of authenticity or criteria of historicity to mine out some facts out of the Gospels. And as Dr. Ehrman pointed out, these criteria were developed because of the assumption that the Gospels are not reliable in any broader sense, and that even out of unreliable documents we can sort of mine out certain facts. And that's completely correct. So if all you're doing is saying we can get these facts out of the Gospels, these facts can be defended, and then maybe you'll use the phrase, these facts are reliable, by which you mean this list is a list of true facts, that's not the same thing as defending the reliability of a source. And I think that's important. And that's something that is of interest in my field of epistemology as well. So I just don't think we should use the term reliability if that's all we're defending. What else? Well, in my presentations, I will often distinguish between what I call minimal reliability and what I call high reliability. The concept of minimal reliability is something I'm getting from a book called Hume's Abject Failure by John Earman. He's not a Christian, but he's writing about the deficiencies of David Hume's attack on miracles. And leaving technicalities aside, what Earman means by minimal reliability is that the fact that this source states a certain proposition is some evidence that that proposition is true. I mean, it might only be a little bit, but it's some evidence that this proposition is true. We don't just treat it as basically worthless by itself, okay? And I think that's really important to understand that sometimes people who approach the Gospels aren't even treating them as minimally reliable. So, for example, if a saying reported in John has to be reported in some other document, or an incident reported in John, the scholar demands that it be reported in another document, or else he puts this great big question mark over it, he's not really treating John as even minimally reliable, because the occurrence of this thing in John is not being treated as any evidence in favor of it. It's got to be, it's like, nah, we got to have somebody else who says it. Okay, so that's minimal reliability. But it might only be, if it's something's only minimally reliable, it might provide only a weak reason. Okay. High reliability. Now, I'm dealing informally here, so I'm not going to give you a number. It's understandable that someone should say, well, how high is high? But in informal terms, To say that a source is highly reliable is to say that the occurrence of a statement within that source provides a strong argument that it occurred. So unless there is some at least equally strong argument against it, then that would be a sufficient case. Okay, so, and this is really more than a prima facie case. The term prima facie case is kind of ambiguous and falls, somewhere in there. It could be high reliability, could be minimal reliability, but we're talking about a strong prima facie case here. Okay, so you have satisfied at least an initial burden of proof. Unless you already knew that something was immensely improbable, okay? And then the burden of proof can shift, so why shouldn't we think that this happened then if it's occurring in a highly reliable source? And I'll come back later to how that intersects with miracles. It's an interesting question. Now, the next term I want to investigate is general reliability. This is what inspired this video. Just during this past week, I was reading some portions of a 5 Views book on approaches to apologetics. It was published in the early 21st century. And the phrase general reliability came up in there, and it really struck me that phrase is ambiguous. Now, this is a phrase I've used before. I may end up using it again because it's become somewhat of a habit to use it. But it struck me that it is an ambiguous phrase. When we say that a source is generally reliable, do we mean as opposed to being highly reliable? Or do we mean as opposed to being infallible? Or do we mean we're not arguing that it's highly reliable? It might be, but we're not arguing that. Or we're not arguing that it's inerrant or infallible. It might be, but we're not arguing that. We're merely arguing that it's generally reliable. Or we're merely saying it's generally reliable. Where does that fall on that minimally versus highly reliable spectrum? Because I can easily imagine a context where you would say, John is generally reliable, but just every once in a while he really messes up, And in that case, you obviously don't mean highly reliable. Or, this ancient author is generally reliable, but sometimes he lies. And you might say that about Josephus, for example. He meets the minimal reliability condition, but we know that sometimes he bends the truth. I can think of a case where I believe Josephus has deliberately bent the truth. Okay, well then I'm not going to call him highly reliable, but I might call him generally reliable. So generally reliable, it's got all this unclarity to it. And therefore, I think that if I want to say that a document is highly reliable, I should say that instead of saying that it's generally reliable. Maybe I've used it before to mean generally highly reliable, is it's highly reliable across the board or something like that. But if that's what I mean, that's what I should say. This came up in this 5 Views book because there's an essay in there by Dr. Gary Habermas, and he's talking about showing the reliability of the Gospels and why he uses his minimal facts approach to arguing for Christianity instead. And what he said was, we might have a ancient source, and he uses Tacitus as an example. And we might say that that author is generally reliable, but if that author tells about a wonder or a supernatural event, we would not automatically accept that just because it was in that document. But in the case of Christianity, we're arguing for a miracle, we're arguing for the resurrection of Jesus, and so he said, I don't think arguing for general reliability of the scriptures is the way to go. I think that was his phrase. I don't think it's the way to go. And then he advocates his minimal facts approach instead. Now, I think Dr. Habermas raises a legitimate point there concerning general reliability. That general reliability isn't necessarily the same thing as high reliability. he's also right to say that if something is generally reliable, that doesn't mean that we just accept a miracle claim from it uncritically. In fact, I would say that even if something of source is highly reliable, we don't automatically accept a miracle claim from it uncritically. And that's something I'll come back to in just a moment. The point I want to make right now is that Dr. Habermas draws attention there to the ambiguity of the phrase general reliability. And this is why the maximal data approach that I'm advocating to the Gospels does not say the Gospels are reliable, the Gospels say that Jesus rose from the dead, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? Now, why not? You might say. Well, you think they're highly reliable, right? And you said that if they're highly reliable, that presents a strong prima facie case. Well, there you go, I think it is legitimate to acknowledge that miracles have a higher burden of proof than non-miraculous occurrences. I want to acknowledge that. And I even talked about this a little bit 2 weeks ago in my video on rainbow bodies. Supernatural, paranormal, and miraculous events do have a higher burden of proof, that we don't just accept them from somebody like, oh, I trust that guy, and he said he saw a miracle, so there you go. So what role does the high reliability of the Gospels play in the argument for the resurrection? I talked about that 2 weeks ago as well, but I want to say it again here because I think it shows how the maximal data approach is more nuanced than people sometimes realize. When my husband Tim and I argue and for the resurrection of Jesus and we make use of the reliability of the Gospels, here's what we're doing. We're saying that since the Gospels have shown themselves to be highly reliable, and since they were written by people who were either witnesses or were able to talk to witnesses, people very close to the facts, we take it that they are not deliberately embellished. In other words, the accounts of the resurrection of Jesus are the accounts that came from the people who would have been in a position to know, those witnesses. Okay, so when it says that Jesus ate with his disciples, that wasn't something that was added later on to make it look more like he really rose from the dead, that somebody just made up. That isn't something that got added because somebody thought, well, surely he must have eaten with them or something like that. It was actually part of the content of what the original witnesses claimed. We're getting that from high reliability, non-embellishment, authenticity. And authenticity isn't per se the same thing as truth. For something to be authentic, for example, if you have a document that claims to be written by the Apostle Paul, if it's authentic, it comes from Paul. Okay? If you have an account in the Gospels and it's authentic, that means I'm using that to mean it comes from someone who was in a position to know. And so, particularly with the things that the apostles would have witnessed themselves, that they didn't have to get from anybody else, then we've got two Gospels that we can argue were written by apostles, and we've got two Gospels that we can argue were written by close companions of apostles who would have had a chance to talk to other apostles. And they've shown themselves again and again to be accurate with respect to many things we can check out and all kinds of different evidences. Therefore, when they say that Jesus ate fish, that they had lengthy conversations with him and so forth, we take it that that's what the disciples themselves, the original witnesses, claimed. Or when they say that Mary Magdalene met with Jesus, talked with her, and had that conversation with her, then that's what Mary Magdalene claimed. Okay? And so that's not just going, they're highly reliable, they say Jesus rose from the dead, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. But it's also not saying, well, gee, I don't know, let's see if we can mine something out of them, or something like that. Instead, It's taking it that these robust accounts, these detailed accounts, came from the original witnesses, and then we go to the context of persecution recounted in Acts and what they were risking for this, and we put together that intersection of things they could not be readily mistaken about, could not be readily duped about. Whether you're eating with your best friend is not the kind of thing that you can just be easily mistaken about, and the risks that they took. And it's that intersection that leads to an inference to the best explanation, and I would say a very strong one, that what they said is true. Now, how does this notion of high reliability intersect with non-miraculous content? I think this is important. When something doesn't have a strong argument against it or a low prior probability, and I think that miracles should have a somewhat low prior probability, then a highly reliable source that says that ought, I think, to be sufficient grounds for accepting it, at least for the time being, unless some strong argument is brought against it. Now, this concern or carefulness can apply to non-miraculous things. If the Gospel of John said that Jesus stood on his head and turned handsprings when he gave the bread of life discourse, I would have some doubts about that, because standing on his head and turning handsprings really doesn't fit with what we have elsewhere, even in the Gospel of John, much less in the Synoptic Gospels, as Jesus' personality. It doesn't fit with the culture, etc., etc., etc. I mean, it's really very improbable, even though it's not miraculous. And that's an illustration of something we would doubt, and it would accordingly downgrade my assumption or my conclusion of John's reliability. But what we find is that there are a lot of things that are not miraculous in themselves that come under unnecessary doubt on the part of scholars on the basis of very weak arguments or even no argument at all. I pointed out before that the mere fact that John is the only source that has something, and that's it, and that's enough sometimes that they'll put a question mark over it. Well, that's terrible reason. That's definitely not even treating him as minimally reliable, much less highly reliable. Or take, for example, the I am sayings. Something I note a lot in interviews, but if you haven't heard it before, you're hearing it here now. There's nothing miraculous about Jesus saying, before Abraham was, I am. Not a miracle, folks. There's nothing miraculous about Jesus saying, I and the Father are one. So the kinds of doubts that are raised about this, I believe, are very weak. They're very frivolous. Something about the messianic secret. Terrible argument. Why is it in the Synoptics? Why isn't it in the Synoptics? Terrible argument from silence, that is. Something about Johannine idiom, something. Terrible argument. And I deal with all of those in the eye of the beholder. Please get a hold of a copy. But the point is, these are very frivolous arguments on the basis of which to question a source that is so highly reliable as John has otherwise shown himself to be. So I believe the fact that John says that Jesus stood there and he said, before Abraham was, I am, in Jerusalem on the occasion accounted, and he said it in a recognizable way that you would have been able to recognize if you had been there and you had understood the language, is enough. That should be enough. It's a very reliable source. So for non-miraculous events that don't have some other very strong argument against them or very strong reason to think that they didn't occur, when they're affirmed in a highly reliable source, I think that ought to be sufficient to take them to have occurred. For miraculous events, if it's in a highly reliable source that's not, a lot later, if it's a source that would have been close to the facts and we've argued that it's highly reliable, then I think we should take it that authentically this is what the witnesses that are said to have been present actually claimed. Then we go from there to talk about, well, could they have been mistaken? Could their interpretation have been wrong? Could they have been lying? Okay, could there have been fraud? Could they have been the victims of fraud, etc.? And we go further, so that doesn't automatically mean that it occurred. I think it's good to see how these different concepts of reliability all play out. And one of the things that I think this does is that it shows that the reportage approach that I'm advocating to the Gospels here and the maximal data approach that I'm advocating to apologetics for Christianity is a genuine alternative to a lot of other things. It doesn't fall into any of these other categories. So it's not skepticism, but it's also not credulity, but it's also not the criteriological approach. It's not the minimal facts approach, and so forth. Okay, it's not just a straight induction. Gospels are reliable. Gospels say a miracle happened, so the miracle happened. It's different from all of those. And I think it differs in ways that are productive and fruitful and therefore very worthy of consideration in all of its specificity and nuance. Thanks for watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, hit that bell for notifications. You will get content here that you will not find anywhere else on the internet. So please do that and follow my Facebook page, my Lydia McGrew author Facebook page. I've just had a couple of peer-reviewed articles published in the Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism on the genre of the Gospels and on chronology in the Gospels. And if you're interested in that, please go and look up those links. I can also supply those links below. Those weren't the topics I was talking about today, but I'm real pleased that those have just finally come out. They were accepted a while ago, and now they've come out and they're free. They're free online. Once again, be sure to like and subscribe and come back next time. Thanks for watching.